So you want to know one thing that I've determined is both a blessing and a curse about having a YouTube channel, and that's the fact that you can go back, look at all of your past content, and see exactly when it was that you last worked on a project. A year. It's been a year. What's going on, guys? Welcome to Moonbuilt Garage. So it has been a year since I worked on this roll-around workbench. I originally built this so that it would be an outfeed for the table saw that I have here. Also has toolboxes underneath to store all my, most used tools. And on the back side is a mitre station, and there will be a router table. Now I designed this thing in a very specific way. So I had a previous version that I built that worked really well. It was a good height, it was a good size, but the storage, I overlooked the storage. A lot of my storage ended up on the back side that went against the wall. I couldn't access it. And I didn't realize it until I got done. I was like, this is pretty dumb. I can't get to the tools that I need to get to because they're up against the wall. So when I designed this bench, I designed it around these two toolboxes and the table saw. So again, I made it so that it's an outfeed. The hell am I stepping on? So I made it so it's an outfeed for the table saw, and then the toolboxes are right here in the front so that when it's against the wall, I can get to all of my mostly used tools. And then the mitre station will be on the back. The router table will be on the side towards the back corner. And that way, when it's against the wall, I can get to this whole work area, have plenty of room to work, and still have access to my mostly used tools. So, with that being said, I think today I'm going to work on getting the tabletop or the work surface cut out back there for the mitre saw. That way I can have that accessed. And I'm hopefully going to get the router plate installed. I got to build a jig so I can get that cut into the tabletop. But I got to get the mitre station done first because that's going to kind of dictate where some of my T-track is going to go. And then I'll be able to design the location for the router table around all that. So I'm going to start with the mitre station. All right, so I'm going to start with the mitre saw station. Now, the mitre saw is going to go right here, and then it's going to sit flush with the work surface and the table saw. That's the word, table saw. So I'm going to start with the mitre station. So the mitre saw is going to go here when it's in use. When it's not in use, it's stored underneath the bench, and then I can drop it into a cutout. It's going to go right here, and that will give me the ability to use the work surface on this side and the table saw on this side to act as supports for longer cuts. And then again, when it's not in use, the saw goes underneath, and there will be a drop-in piece that'll sit here, and that'll give me the ability to have a larger work surface, kind of like it is now when the mitre saw is stored beneath. So I need to cut this area out to make room for the mitre saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this out as close as I can to the supports underneath with a jigsaw, and then I'm going to use my router with this bit as a bearing on it that'll ride on the frame underneath to cut everything flush. So I got to cut this thing out first. All right, so I've laid out the boundaries of my cutout area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the drill. I'm going to drill a couple of holes up in the corners. And then I'm going to use my jigsaw to roughly cut out the area. I'm going to stay just inside the line here, and then I'll come back with the router and clean that whole thing up. I just don't want to cut into the supports underneath with the jigsaw. All right, so there you can get a better idea of just how the miter station is going to work. This top piece will come out. I'll be able to drop the miter saw in place. Now, I still need to shim the miter saw. I did design this so it sat a little bit below the surface, and that way I could shim the saw to get it perfectly in line. I didn't want to try to, weld everything and account for all the thicknesses of the wood and try to get it perfectly level. I did purposely leave this, I don't know, what is it, a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8. I don't even think it's an 1/8. I think it's like a 1/16 of an inch or so below this surface. So eventually I'll get this shimmed up. But now what I want to do is I'm going to kind of use this fence to get an idea, start laying out some T-tracks, and that'll give me an idea of where the miter station can go down on this end of the table. All right, so I got the position of the Kreg Precision Router Lift all figured out, along with the beginnings of some T-track. Now, so the router table is going to go right here on this end of the table, this corner, and the T-tracks are not only going to act as a mount for the fence for the router table, but I'm also going to lay out other T-track around the table, and that's going to give me area for clamping work to that for glue up or for sanding or whatever reason I may need to clamp something down. Now, before I continue with the router table, I think I want to work on the enclosure for the cutout for the miter station. Reason being is this piece of T-track is going to go all the way across, and there are other things I want to get done, and having a full work surface will just be that much more helpful. So I think I'm going to put the miter station, the miter saw down below, and figure out the cutout to get this area enclosed. All right, so I got the drop-in panel for the miter saw location all finished up, but let me show you something. So I made the top out of plywood. I was thinking about MDF, but I ran into issues with MDF on my last box, on my last workbench. But this is a white birch plywood, and I got it because it was super smooth on top, whereas some other, obviously builder grade stuff is a lot rougher. But this stuff was $90 a sheet, and that outer veneer, I used painter's tape to mark my lines and to keep the edges from doing something like this, from kind of chipping away there. And when I took the painter's tape off, it peeled that veneer right off there. I mean, that is literally, I think paper is probably thicker than that veneer. So yeah, I'm not really happy with that, but it is a workbench. It's going to get beat up. The plywood top will eventually get replaced. So I'm just going to have to live with it for now. So now I'm going to move on to the miter table location. So I'm laying out a jig on some 3/4 inch MDF, and all I did was I took the top of the miter plate and I traced it out here on the MDF, and now I'm laying out the edges that I'll probably do the rounded corners with this 1.5" Forstner bit. Seems to be just the right radius to match up to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this out, cut it down to size, and this is going to become my jig to then cut into the workbench top. All right, so a little dusty, but there I've got the jig cut out, and I've got it pretty much lined up right where I want it. Now here's the router plate. We'll be able to drop right in. Now, my plan now is to clamp this in place, and then I'm going to use the plate and the jig to set the router depth, and I'll show you that in just a second. All right, so here I've got the jig clamped to the workbench, and I've got the router plate on top of the jig. Now what that's going to allow me to do is to set the depth of my router bit. So by running this down, that gives me the depth that I need to cut into the work surface or into the workbench top. So now I can move the jig and I could run the router down, and this bearing here will ride right along the jig. But what I want to do is I want to go just a little bit deeper than just the plate thickness into the work surface. So I'm going to shim it just a little bit. I'm just going to use a straight edge or, you know, a scale. And that's going to give me just a little bit extra depth on the router bit. Now what that's going to do is when I cut into the surface, it'll be just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the router plate. And then that'll allow me to shim the router plate perfectly level with the workbench top. So that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm just going to route, and what I'm going to do is route along the edge, and that's going to give me a shelf for the plate to sit on, and then I'll cut the center out to give room for the router. The center cutout doesn't matter. All I need really is a lip or a plate or a shelf, basically around the edge of the opening. So let me get that going and I'll show you how it's done. All right, so there's the router plate in place. Now it does sit just below the work surface, the workbench. I did that on purpose. So now I need to get 8 threaded inserts, 4 for the mounting screws, and they'll just get drilled in to these locations in the corner. And that'll give me a place to install the mounting screws. The other 4 threaded inserts are for these nylon screws. And they'll go through there and they'll sit as a base for the router plate to actually rest on. And then I'll be able to adjust these up or down to get the router plate perfectly flush or perfectly level with the work surface. They'll just act as little standoffs, and then these will tighten down and everything will be perfectly mounted in place. Now, I do need to trim this support that I put in there. My router table ended up shifted over further than what I thought it would when I built the frame. But that's all right, it's no big deal. I'll be able to trim that back and then the router will be able to bolt up. But that's the router plate in place. All right, so I realized during editing that I explained the whole nylon screw leveling system for the router plate backwards. Let me show you. All right, so you can see with the router plate in place, there's a lip right there. It doesn't sit flush with the surface of the workbench. So the nylon nuts, there's one on each side that I put a threaded insert in from the bottom. Now I had to cut them short because they were a little too long because of the thickness of the plywood. But now what I can do is, if I can find my screwdriver, there it is, right in front of my face, the nylon nut or the nylon screw is right there. And it comes up from the bottom, and then I can turn this and it'll start to protrude up. And now what I can do is I can set my plate in place. I can put a straight edge, and I can come up from underneath and I can run that screw up until that plate now sits perfectly flush. And I can do that on all four sides. So same thing over here. This is a little, it sits, see how it's catching? See how it hits? So now I can, oops, take my nylon screw here. I can run it up from the bottom and then take a screwdriver and run that screw in again until it pushes that plate up. From the bottom, it pushes it up. Why is that? Is it that far off? There we go. Oh, I put it in the wrong mounting. I put it in through the mounting hole. Oops. Hang on. Let me run that back out and put it in the right threaded insert there. I was like, why isn't it lifting? Because it's coming up through the mounting hole. All right. Yeah, that was my bad, guys. So now that I got the screw in the right spot, I can run it up and you can see it's lifting the whole thing. And again, now it sits perfectly flush. I can do the same thing on the sides here. Run it up. It starts to push up on the plate until it sits perfectly. Still a little off. There we go. Perfectly level. Then run this one up, same thing. And now it's actually resting on those nylon screws and not on the shelf around the edge directly. But now, when I run in my mounting screws, they will actually, it'll tighten everything down. I can go back and make fine adjustments. And that router plate will be perfectly flush with the surface. This side still needs to come up some more. But that's how you level a router plate. So yeah, that's how you mount your router plate. You can go back, you can just dial everything in so everything sits perfectly level with your workbench, and everything will be nice and secure. All right, so now that I got the miter saw location cut out and I got the filler plate made, I got the router plate cut out and everything's ready to get mounted there. All I gotta do is, like I said, get those threaded inserts and then trim that support bracket underneath there a little bit. But with all that done, I think that's where I'm gonna call it for this video. Seems like a good place to stop. Appreciate you guys for watching. Hit that subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you on the next one.